all had to experience in the last couple of years. Students have had to pivot their work as a function of what was available to them. And so this work comes out of a project that Chasten was working on as part of her PhD dissertation, where initially she wanted to look at reading comprehension in bilingual children and trying to better understand the component skills that are necessary for reading success in both the first and second language. So how did we get here? We got here essentially because when she switched her topic, she was interested in thinking about, well, what are teachers' knowledge about late emerging reading disabilities? And we were going to be collecting the data in the spring of 2021, at a time when education really was not, still to some extent is, but was really not unfolding as it typically does. And so as part of the series of questionnaires that she put together as part of her project, her main focus was on what do teachers know about late emerging reading disabilities. If you're interested in that topic, she'll be presenting on that as part of her dissertation when she's finished. But we also wanted to get a sense of who are our teachers that were actually participating in our study. What are some of their background beliefs? How are they feeling about their own self-efficacy? And how are they feeling in terms of burnout right now? Right? Because at this point, we will have been essentially online for a year when the data was collected. And so we recognized we were collecting data in the sort of pinpoint of time, right? And so what we wanted to do was to get a better sense holistically of who these teachers were. Well, then Chasten collected her data and she said, goodness, I have so much data associated with my primary question that I'm not quite sure what to do with this additional data that we've collected. So that's where Anadi came onto the scene for this project. She was an honors thesis student from the psychology department. And so she came in, we had this data collected, and what she was interested in was looking at the relationships amongst these background questionnaires that we collected, looking at the constructs really of inclusive beliefs, self-efficacy, and really burnout. So, as we can imagine, or as we know, teacher burnout remains really a significant concern in education, and it always has. And certainly the likelihood is it's been heightened during the pandemic. And so what we really sort of were thinking about with this project was trying to better understand the relationship between burnout and other factors. And so when we think about occupational burnout, it really refers to reduced job performance as a function of either physical or emotional fatigue or depletion. Okay, and so really people feeling like they can't do their job to the best of their ability and are really feeling sort of that emotional piece to it. Well, thinking about this is really important for several reasons, one of which is simply teacher well-being, but another is thinking about our school systems in general, right? And thinking about, well, in addition to poor job performance, you know, if you're not feeling satisfied or not feeling well in your job, then you're likely to leave it. Right? And thinking about then teacher attrition. And this was certainly a problem pre-pandemic as well. So one of the things that we know is that countries, including Canada, all experience high levels of attrition among new teachers. And the same source reports that in the Canadian province of Alberta, approximately 40% of new teachers leave the profession in the first 5 years. And you'll note this is an article that came out well before the pandemic, right? So this has been a long enduring problem. And so what we might be interested then is thinking about, you know, the attrition leads to teacher shortages, and we know we're experiencing teacher shortages right now, and that further stresses our educational system. It stresses our students, and it also stresses the remaining teachers who are still in the system trying to do perhaps more than their job, right? And so part of what we were interested then is trying to better understand factors that are related to burnout. So it's important both to understand burnout and what are the factors associated with it? So those are the key pieces that were really critical in this project. So we can delve in a little bit more deeply to what burnout is. So one model of burnout suggests that it involves 3 different components. The first is just that emotional exhaustion piece, right? So teachers are feeling emotionally drained, and that can result in difficulties regulating emotions. So greater anger, greater anxiety, depression, emotional breakdown, right? And so inability to regulate those emotions certainly make doing your job more difficult. Second component, come on in, or not. Second component is depersonalization. So the idea that teachers might feel disconnected from their students, and then no longer be able to teach them to the best of their ability. And if we think about our school systems now, and we think about inclusion, one of the key components of inclusion is really knowing your students and being able to create an inclusive environment that supports all of their strengths and all of their needs. And so if there's this disconnect or this distancing, that's really not going to support the ability to teach students in a way that's going to maximize their abilities, right? And then the other piece in terms of that professional accomplishment and feeling about professional accomplishment and feeling like that you're not as successful as you would like to be. So teachers might feel that they're not reaching their full professional potential because they're not meeting their own expectations about what they should be able to accomplish in their classroom, right? So all of these things feed into how we think about burnout, right? So we've got sort of burnout as a construct. We also want to be thinking about, well, what's related to burnout? So what are those factors? So self-efficacy is one that's a really key consideration when we're thinking about how people are feeling about how effective they are in their job. So in education, self-efficacy typically defined as a teacher's belief regarding their effectiveness in the classroom. And it's really important to recognize that this is their belief on how they perceive that they're doing, right? That being said, your belief about how you're doing really impacts what you plan to do next, right? So if you feel like you're effective in your job, it's going to impact the type of learning environment that you create, the type of opportunities you create for students, the way you assess, all of those things likely are all interrelated, right? So we know that teachers with high self-efficacy are really action-oriented, right? They're going to notice problems of practice and they're going to try to address them head on, right? In contrast, teachers with low self-efficacy can avoid those problems, focus on the emotional piece, and maybe distance themselves, right? And so really that distancing might lead to burnout because again, you're not feeling that you're doing your job particularly well, and presumably that's going to result in these feelings. So when we think about self-efficacy, there's been a fair bit of work looking at how self-efficacy relates to various constructs within education. And I've put together a figure to sort of identify some of those relationships. If you're interested in the references associated with them, happy to share. But what you can see here is that previous work has found that there's an association between self-efficacy and observed instructional quality. So you'll recall a minute or so ago, I said self-efficacy is how we perceive our own ability to do our job. It's nice to know that how other people perceive the quality of our instruction is actually associated with that. So people aren't out to lunch and how they're perceiving their own ability. So that's a good thing. We also know that teaching enthusiasm is related to self-efficacy. So the more you feel good about your own effectiveness in your job, the more enthusiasm you show in your teaching. Also, the types of practices that you engage in, right? So using inclusive teaching strategies, also positively associated with self-efficacy, and thinking about using universal design for learning principles are associated with self-efficacy, greater self-efficacy. So all of these things really lead themselves to potentially good things happening for our students and all of our students in the classroom, right? Importantly, there's also a relationship with inclusive beliefs, right? So individuals who indicate that they feel more effective in their classroom are much more inclined to take a mentality that includes all students and allows them all to participate fully in the classroom in terms of how they approach their instruction and how they believe instruction is important. Okay, so self-efficacy is clearly an important construct in how teachers go about their daily lives. What about its relationship to burnout? So there have been several studies that have found that there's a negative relationship with burnout, right? So that intrinsically makes a fair bit of sense. The more you feel good about how you're doing your job, the less burnt out you're likely to feel, right? In terms of the research in this space, it's pretty robust and it's pretty consistent. So there was a meta-analysis in 2012 done by Brown looking at 11 studies that have looked at this relationship. All of those studies found this negative correlation, and there's been a few studies since then also demonstrating that relationship. So that's good to know, right? You'd hope that if people are feeling good about how they're doing, that they're not going to then be burnt out. The relationship that we know a lot less about is the relationship between inclusive beliefs and burnout, right? So we could take a couple different hypotheses. We could say, well, if you've got really strong inclusive beliefs, and perhaps you're not able to be as effective in your role, then it may be the case that you're experiencing burnout because you're not meeting, there's that reduced sense of personal accomplishment, right? So it could be the case that inclusive beliefs, that there's a negative relationship. Hopefully that's not the case, right? Because we have an educational system that is where the framework is inclusion, right? So ideally what we want to be seeing is the more inclusive beliefs you have, the more you would hope, as we see, the better you feel about your job and the less burnout you have in general, right? So what we were interested in this project was, well, what's the relationship here if there is one? And then the other piece of that puzzle is, how does that relate to self-efficacy? Is it just self-efficacy that's explaining any performance and burnout, or can inclusive beliefs also have some explanatory power? So that's a bit where we're going. And it's really important to be thinking about the value of understanding the relationship between burnout and inclusive beliefs, because we know how important inclusion is, right? So almost 30 years ago, if we're getting close to 30 years ago, it's hard to believe, the Salamanca Statement by UNESCO made a commitment, or indicated a commitment, that all students, regardless of any special needs, must be provided with access to a regular education system in a classroom with age-appropriate peers in their local school, right? And so as part of a teacher education program, we need to support our teacher educators to both have this belief and live this belief and show this belief in their practice, right? The challenge is that researchers have said, well, a potential problem with inclusion is that the classroom demands just might lead to greater stress and greater burnout, right? And so part of that is thinking, well, how do we support our students to be able to meet those classroom demands in terms of their practice? And so the one study I was able to find looking at the relationship between burnout and inclusive beliefs was conducted in Israel. And in this study, Tamar et al. Found that teachers in Israel who indicated that they had more positive attitudes towards inclusion experienced less fulfillment. So that's troubling, right? That's problematic in terms of thinking, ooh, what's going on here? Well, the authors of this paper essentially said, it wasn't so much this relationship that they were focused on. It was the fact that the individuals in their study reported that they didn't feel like they had the resources to actually live their inclusive beliefs. So they weren't given enough information about their students to support their needs. There wasn't enough assessments done. There wasn't enough resources. And so they were trying their hardest to live inclusion without the resources necessary to do so, and therefore were feeling disappointed in that fulfillment piece, right? So that's what we're seeing in this one study. The question becomes, what are we going to potentially see in a Canadian context? Right, where we're perhaps further down the road, we're not all the way to our destination, but we're seeing some real commitment towards inclusion as we continue forward. So the current study, what did we look at? It involved the following: to look at that relationship, whether inclusive beliefs were related to teacher-reported burnout scores. And then we also wanted to replicate the finding about self-efficacy and burnout scores, because that would be a good indication to us that our measures are really, picking up what we think they're measuring. But we also wanted to know, well, if self-efficacy does explain burnout, does inclusive beliefs also explain burnout, but unique variants? So that it's not explaining the same variants, but these are two separate factors that are contributing towards our understanding of how teachers are reporting their level of burnout in their jobs. So, participants, Chaston collected data from 62 Ontario's teachers. I should indicate these are all elementary school teachers, because the original focus of the study was looking at their understanding of late emerging reading disabilities in students in grades 4 through 6. So we were looking at elementary teachers. You can see that the majority of our sample were females, which sort of aligns with not to this extent, but to the fact that we have more female elementary teachers. The other thing to note about this is that when they were approached about the study, we didn't say anything about burnout, right? We just wanted to get a sense of where they were finding themselves. They had an average age of about 40, with plus or minus 9 years, and an average number of teaching experience years of about 15. with a range from 2 to 37. So a real nice range in terms of people who chose to participate in the study. And as I said, the data was collected in the winter, spring of 2021. Okay. So what did they see in terms of the questionnaires they were given? So they were given 3 questionnaires in addition to the reading stuff. And the questionnaires, the first one I want to talk about is the belief about learning and teaching questionnaire. This questionnaire picks up 4 different constructs related to teachers' beliefs about how students learn and how they should be teaching them. So what you'll see is, and I haven't put the whole questionnaire here, but you can see at the top, the first few items are all under the heading or the construct of teacher controlled. So if you read those items, you can see things like, it's important for students to complete assignments exactly as the teacher planned, or students cannot be counted on to evaluate their own work. It's important for teachers, not students, to direct the flow of the lesson, right? So you see a very, I want to say, sort of traditional transmission perspective of how teaching should happen. And so that's the sort of the teacher control piece. And I would suggest that when, at least at the university level, and perhaps at the teacher candidate level as well, when we start teaching, there's a sense that we want to hang on to that control and really sort of transmit that information to our students, right? If we look at the bottom of the questionnaire here, where it says SC, that means student-centered. So those particular items are related to the students being the directors of the learning to some extent. So these items you can see is good teachers give students choice in their learning tasks. Or to assess students' understanding of a core concept, it's important to observe and listen to them as they work, right? So when we hear some of those items, it really is more in line with that idea of recognizing that student needs are going to drive the entry points to where you're going to support them in the classroom and the types of differentiated instruction that you're going to provide. So taking that approach, I would argue, is certainly much more of an inclusive practice because you're trying to make sure that everyone is being given support and that there's access for everyone, right? The other piece of the constructs that I want to highlight for you here are in the middle. And what you can see here, it says EI, that means entity incremental. And this is about how we perceive students' ability to learn. So on one end of the spectrum, we've got incremental, meaning that there's a belief that students can learn, that it's not fixed, that there's a growth mindset, and that through the supports that we give students, we can support them through this incremental growth. The other end is entity beliefs, and the idea that learning is fixed. And so you can see from the items here, we've got the ability to learn is something that remains fixed throughout life. The ability to learn is something that people have a certain amount of, and there isn't much I can do to change it, right? The challenge with those types of views is if you're a teacher and you're assuming that your students can't learn, what are you actually going to be doing with them? And so there's some, well, the outcome's not great, but there's some nice research to indicate that people who tend to have these entity beliefs tend to limit the amount of effort they put towards the students in their class that they feel are struggling, right? Which is perhaps where we need, which is definitely where we need to make sure those needs are met. I won't even say perhaps, right? So we can see here that type of belief has the potential to be problematic for sure, right? So let's sort of see. The other piece that I have not shown you here in terms of items, there's another construct called attaining standards, which is essentially the extent to which somebody believes that grades are the important outcome of education, or that grades tell you something about how people have learned, right? Okay, so the second questionnaire is about efficacy, and hopefully I've convinced you that it's important for us to know something about how teachers feel about their own effectiveness when we talk about burnout, because we think that's going to be an important predictor of burnout. And so here there are 3 different constructs. I won't get into them in as much detail because I'll warn you that we just collapse them into overall self-efficacy. But in this questionnaire, there are 3. One is managing behavior. So you can see what item here is, I can make my expectations clear about student behavior. The second one is collaboration. So something like, I can make parents feel comfortable coming to school. And then the third one is inclusive instruction. So I can accurately gauge student comprehension of what I've taught, right? So there are 6 items of each of those categories, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, okay? And then our last questionnaire is our burnout survey here. And these all are items having to do with, not feeling connected to your job anymore and the emotional pieces. So I'm weary with all of my job responsibilities. My job doesn't excite me anymore. The other thing is that this is specific to teachers. So there's items such as I avoid communication with students, right? So all of these distancing pieces or depersonalization or, emotional, just being tired, essentially. And so strongly disagree to strongly agree. So before I get into sort of what predicts what, I thought it would be helpful to give a sense of, well, as a group, what do our teachers look like on how they performed on these questionnaires, or how they respond on these questionnaires. So what you can see is I've got the teachers' beliefs about learning and teaching, their self-efficacy, and then their total burnout scores. And so with respect to student-centered versus teacher-controlled, what you can see here is that in general, if I compare this, our teachers are much more student-centered. So to my mind, that's a yay, right? They're responsive to student needs, and that directs how they're going to teach their content. And so you can see that the score there is, closing in on 5, which is essentially an agree, right? In terms of teacher-controlled, you can see that they're at a 3, which is basically a somewhat disagree with that statement. You can also, however, see that there's a nice range of scores for us to work with as we're trying to think about the correlational relationships. So although, but you can certainly see that they're slid in particular ways, right? We've got teacher controlled going from 1 to almost 5 versus 3.8 to 6, right? So that's a good thing. The other thing that we can see is that they have predominantly incremental beliefs. So they're really pushing back against the items that say, no matter what I can do, the student won't learn. So that's really good as well, right? So the 1.75 is basically disagree with that statement. But that being said, we still have a range from 1 to 4. So we're working with some range there. With respect to attaining standards, people are basically in the somewhat disagree range about the importance of grades in general. So, the pattern here looks really good, and the pattern also looks pretty consistent with previous research that Jackie and her colleagues have done with teachers in Ontario and across Canada. So that's good, I think. I hope that's a fair statement. In terms of overall self-efficacy, it was really very high. So remember, the total could be as high as 6. You do see the range. Some people don't feel that effective. But overall, there's basically a sense of, we agree, we're effective. So that's good. And it's quite similar across subtypes, and to be not overly meaningful to tease them apart. So we just collapsed them overall in terms of what self-efficacy was. And then in terms of burnout, the good thing is overall our teachers weren't particularly burnt out. And that potentially has something to do with, asking people to participate in research in the first place. It's a little bit of a catch-22 to study burnout and ask people who, may be burned out to actually do the study. But that being said, there's still a pretty good range from 20 to 62. And burnouts, basically, they have half of them were in sort of the few burnout symptoms, and half of them were in the some burnout symptoms, but not serious range. Okay, so that's those are our mean scores with our range and our standard deviation. What about the relationship between these? So what you can see here is correlation table. And just as a reminder, if you end up with a correlation that's outside of -1 to 1, then you've done something wrong. So we're in a good space here. And the closer it is to -1 or to 1, the stronger the relationship. So we found our negative relationship between self-efficacy and burnout. So yay, we've replicated the results of previous studies. And in fact, the magnitude of the correlation is pretty similar. So it's a moderate correlation similar to previous research. And as you might expect, the more we feel good about our job, the less burnout we actually feel. What about sort of the new piece of the puzzle here with respect to our teachers' beliefs? Well, you can see that we do still get some significant correlation. The next strongest one has to do with the incremental entity piece. So if people circled the options to endorse the statements about fixed ability more, right? If they indicated that they didn't believe that students could learn very well, they also had higher burnout. Okay, so we see that here. The other two are teacher controlled and attaining standards. So in that case as well, we've got this moderate correlation where if you're more prone to say teaching should be teacher controlled, or it should be about grades, you're feeling more worn down. Okay. So that's sort of our burnout line, and that's the line we're going to be trying to predict in the next slide. But I think it's also helpful to navigate the other correlations a little bit. So if we think about teachers' own practice and their self-efficacy in their practice, what you can see is that 0.4, that positive value, the more people endorsed student-centered practices, the more they felt that they were effective in their job. So that's good, because that aligns with previous research to say that having those inclusive beliefs are correlated with self-efficacy. Interestingly here, if you endorse a teacher control belief where you're trying to, transmit information and collect information, but not necessarily do it in a way that takes student needs into account as well, you're feeling more burned out. The other relationships, and we don't see any other relationships with self-efficacy and incremental entity or attaining standards. The other piece I wanted to sort of show is the idea perhaps that teacher-controlled and student-centered are sort of two sides of the same coin. And so we're seeing if you're more student-centered, you tend to be less teacher-controlled, and vice versa, right? And the final piece I want to point out between here is sort of this constellation of behaviors, right? So if you're teacher-controlled, you also tend to be more entity-based, you also tend to value grades more. Okay, so you can imagine sort of the profile of the teacher who endorses those beliefs versus the ones who don't endorse those beliefs as being separate. Okay, so we've got sort of the idea of our relationships, and that's going to really help drive how we think about our regression analysis where we're trying to predict burnout. So here's our regression analysis. There's two. There's one that's the full model, and in this model, I basically took what I did was I took all 5 of our predictors, I put it into the regression model, and what I was asking was which variables significantly predict burnout. And what you can see is that self-efficacy certainly does, in very much the same relationship we've been talking about all the way through, right? So greater burnout, less self-efficacy. The other piece that's marginally significant is the other correlation that was the second strongest in our previous table, so that increment entity belief. The other 3 variables aren't significant in this model, and I would argue it's because they're related to the entity belief. So those are sort of picking up some of the same profile. So really, we're only seeing entity as being the one that is representative of that general orientation, if you will. So you can do a backwards regression, and essentially what that will do is any of the variables that are not significant, it'll just take them out one at a time until it arrives at a model with just significant predictors. And so that's what the lower part of the table is showing you here, that really it's self-efficacy and increment entity that are coming out to play in this model and predicting burnout. That being said, as I said, incremental entity feels like it's representative of a profile rather than just sort of a variable itself. So the next thing that we did was we said, okay, can we take our 5 predictor variables and do some data reduction to identify factors? Because we want to say, it's not just this entity belief, it's the factor of teacher control, entity, and attaining standards. So we did a factor analysis to do that, which is essentially throwing the 5 variables into an analysis that allows us to identify which ones are correlated to each other that load on the same factor. And this is probably what we would predict given what I walked you through in our correlation table. So what you can see is that teacher-controlled, entity, attaining standards, all are showing positive values and values closer to 1, indicating that they load onto factor 1. And then, of course, as a researcher, it's my job to try to name what factor 1 is. And so I went with traditional, sort of more didactic approach as my way of labeling sort of what people are preferring in their teaching orientation here. Arguably, the second one's a little bit more clunky because it includes a belief about teaching students and also a belief about their own self-efficacy. So I essentially just called it inclusive beliefs and efficacy. But what you can see is that correlation that we saw where self-efficacy was correlated to student-centered is coming together in a variable to load highly onto this factor. And we can be comfortable that it really is about that student-centered piece because we can see that teacher-controlled actually loads negatively onto this variable. Right, so we've got these sort of these larger factors that we can then put into our analysis here. Okay. So we can do another model where we're just looking at these two factors and put them in. And if we do that, we get essentially that pattern that I was talking to you about, that if individuals are taking this traditional approach, they're feeling, the burnout score is higher, right? If they have greater inclusive beliefs and greater self-efficacy, burnout is lower. So we can get people's scores on each of these factors and then predict what we think their burnout score might be as a function of how they answered these various questions. Okay, and the model accounted for 24% of the variance of burnout scores. So a significant amount, not a huge amount, but keeping in mind this study wasn't originally intended to think about all the variables that could predict burnout. If we were doing a true burnout study at the time we collected data, we might have asked about childcare or elder care or things that were really very important and prevalent at that time in the COVID cycle, if you will, for lack of a better term. But we're still getting robust, significant results that are telling us that these factors are important when we think about burnout. So what's the summary? Well, hopefully at this point, having presented the data to you, you could present the summary to me. And if this was a class, I'd probably ask you to, but I won't. Overall, teachers favored student-centered and incremental views, and they reported higher self-efficacy and generally few signs of burnout. So I want to say that up front because I don't want to make it sound like there's a whole bunch of teachers who are taking this traditional perspective and it's bad. Overall, they weren't really articulating that, but even if they were a little bit, it's really interesting to see that that was still impacting how they thought about their burnout levels. Burnout was positively associated with teacher-controlled, entity and attaining standard beliefs, and it was negatively associated with self-efficacy. And again, if we put those into factors, we saw that self-efficacy and inclusion, lower burnout, and that traditional approach, higher burnout, but they each accounted for unique variance, which I think is pretty cool because they're two sort of separate constructs here. So implications. Well, presumably teachers who feel that they're effective in their jobs experience personal accomplishments, they're meeting their professional expectations, and thereby there's limited feelings of burnout. Importantly, however, here we're seeing that self-efficacy was positively associated with endorsing student-centered learning, but negatively associated with teacher-controlled beliefs, right? So recognizing sort of where self-efficacy, may be fruitful and may be able to grow, right? And so such findings confirm that alignment between inclusive beliefs and effective inclusive practice, and it implies to me anyway, that supporting teachers in developing both inclusive beliefs and practices likely support greater job satisfaction and less burnout. That being said, we have to be careful. This is a correlational study and not a causal study. So when we're thinking about future directions, we might think about, does professional development, and maybe that's professional development, these are all teachers already out in the field, right? So they're not teacher candidates, but does that, if that targets, their self-efficacy beliefs and their inclusion beliefs, or really increases their self-efficacy, does that result in belief changes and fewer feelings of burnout? Right? And it's an empirical question. It's an empirical question that's tough because one of the things we know is that changing people's beliefs are hard, right? So one of the things we might want to be thinking about is, well, what does that look in our teacher education program, right? When we get up in front of a class and try to have them engage in activities that allow them to really understand the value of inclusion and really get that message across, how do we make sure that, they're on board with us and that we're giving them the strategies that are going to allow them to live those beliefs, which is really critical, right? So interesting question. Be interesting to sort of see if we can sort of take a look at what that might look like, either in-service teachers or pre-service teachers. One thing to recognize in terms of those limitations is the study didn't really have a full range of possible scores on all our scales. That being said, I'm not sure I want teachers to be burnt out, knowing that there are teachers who are, right? So how do we sort of collect samples from them, knowing that it's a challenging group to try to recruit from? The other piece is, in terms of the incremental entity piece, most of our people really strongly endorsed incremental views, right? So that's a positive. Right? And then nonetheless, we still saw moderate relationships in line with other studies to find those effects despite some of these truncated ranges. So, maybe it's a limitation, maybe it's a strength to be able to show that within this sample with a bit more of a limited range than it possibly could be. The other piece is that the study was specific to elementary school teachers. And so, we didn't conduct it with high school teachers. Maybe there's a difference in the nature of the relationships. Maybe there's a difference in the strengths of the relationships. Maybe there's a difference in the range of the scores that people would provide us on these scales, right? interesting sort of to think about if there are differences and why might there be differences. So that's sort of where we're thinking. And that's essentially what I had, and I'll have some time for questions as well. But one of the projects that a member of my lab was working on this this fall was creating a lab website. So we have one, and I'm going to start putting it at the bottom of my email so people can go see it as they'd like. We're also going to announce future research opportunities. Right now, you might have seen in the eCast, one of my psychology honor students is doing a project looking for Ontario teachers. And again, this is sort of back in the reading disabilities domain. But if you know anybody who might be interested in participating in a workshop to increase knowledge of late emerging reading disabilities, by all means, reach out to me and I'll pass that information on to her. So thank you very much. Happy for any questions.
Yes. Lots of clapping emojis.
Excellent. If we want, we can turn the shared screen off
Right.
there and see people a little bit better. Jackie has a question or a high five. I'm not sure which.
I'm gonna try to ask a question without coughing. Thanks. That's really interesting work. And you know, the one thing I was thinking about as you were going through is, yeah, mostly female, mostly elementary, right? So I think it would be really interesting to look at this from a secondary perspective, because the work that we've done, we find that male secondary teachers tend to be more entity oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is that when we look at their efficacy, if they're male secondary teachers who tend to be more incremental oriented, they actually are more efficacious. So there's a lot of sort of relationships that go on with that. So I think it would be interesting to certainly continue this work. There hasn't really been a lot done with these beliefs questionnaires, more so with the efficacy. And so I think there's a lot of work that can still be done, certainly in the area. So I would look forward to seeing some of that come out.
Well, that'd be great, Jackie. Yeah, I think this was sort of a fortuitous study that came out of something else that we were doing, and but I agree, and I think with respect to that secondary piece, I'm not convinced these results would generalize, and I do think that we would see a lot more variability in the scores that people are willing to report, for sure. Yeah,
Great, thanks.
Welcome.
Deanna, it's Pam.
Hi, Pam.
Hi. So, a lovely presentation, and as Jackie said, this is very useful and valuable, I think, potentially to boards who are looking at better ways to support their employees, and also, as you said, teacher education possibilities are pretty clear. So first, I just wanted to check, when was this done? I know you said, but I think...
Yeah, it was winter, spring of 2021.
Okay, so it was during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so might you consider, if you're doing further work in this area or one of your students, might you consider doing some interviews with principals?
Well, it would be interesting to get qualitative data here, right? I mean, everything I presented there was quantitative, and a lot of the qualitative types of questions that we've asked have been about teachers' abilities to implement strategies, like specifically with individuals who are struggling with reading. But if I wanted to sort of get more into the burnout literature space, certainly I think getting a sense of what are some of the barriers that teachers are experiencing that may be contributing to burnout, and what are some of the things that they have in place as facilitators, as protective factors, would certainly be helpful. It'd be interesting to sort of get that administrative perspective of what are they seeing versus what teachers on the ground are reporting in a qualitative manner as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The reason I ask that is because pardon me, in my dealings with principals who are doing like their PhD or an EDD, the feedback's been pretty clear about how demanding the pandemic period was and the significant increase in teacher resignations and early retirements. And so I wondered whether there might be room for a study that looked at how principals manage to keep meaning in the work of teachers during high stress periods, right? So if you've got somebody who's highly efficacious, which as your study showed, there's a lot of teachers there who feel that they're highly efficacious, whether the principals at particular schools are influencing those efficacious beliefs by how they create meaning, right? Like
Absolutely.
I think that's potentially helpful to the system, right? As a way of offsetting some of the negative environmental factors like the pandemic or an overly intrusive ministry.
Absolutely. And I think part of the challenge here is that we saw that one of the features of burnout is sort of that deep personalization and that distancing, right? And so when you were at this time, when we were mostly in lockdown and teachers were working from home and there wasn't necessarily that connection to their school community in the same way there would be pre or post pandemic. And so thinking about, not that people want to, but how much easier it is to disappear and not necessarily have somebody know that you're struggling is very clearly problematic. I think what surprised, well, maybe it didn't quite surprise us, but one of the things that surprised me a little bit was, we didn't see people report too much burnout in our sample, but at the same time, these are the teachers who are willing to participate in a study, at this particular time. And I think too, just in terms of the teachers that I know with respect to, what was happening during lockdown, like they were holding online classes for sure, but it wasn't like they were with their students, from 9 to 3 every day. They had, hour and a half period set through. So I don't want to suggest that they had more time, but they were not constantly on, so to speak. And so maybe that facilitated these particular teachers feeling like they could participate in this. I fully acknowledge that there's a huge group of teachers who felt completely overwhelmed, who would have seen our ad and went, absolutely not. That's one more thing to my plate that I don't want to engage in right now. Yeah.
Terrific. Thanks.
Thanks, Pam.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah, Frank.
Thanks, Diana. Very, very interesting. Now I know why I'm burnt out.
Okay.
I'm a control freak. Anyway, at work, not at home. I wonder if it would be interesting to replicate this in a different educational setting, like Japan or China or the Middle East, where maybe teacher-centeredness is much more common.
Yeah.
That you would find the same kind of relationships in terms of maybe teacher-centered teachers find themselves very efficacious because they control their classroom, and you might find different kind of. So this is very much the Ontarian context, and that's of course for us very relevant. But I wonder if you would find different relationships in a different educational context.
Yeah.
So a replication might be interesting.
It might be. I think the challenge. Well, the challenge is to not assume that I know what's going on elsewhere. So it's sort of thinking about partnering with people where
Exactly.
we identify, what's valued here and what may be some of the, what are the conclusions we're drawing and why. So one thing that we could potentially conclude is that, well, people who are working in a school system that is really pushing them towards inclusion and thinking about inclusion based on, the makeup of their classroom and the types of professional development that they're getting, there's something to be said for being part of the crowd that has the same orientation and feeling like you're hopefully getting some of the tools to be effective there. So you're right. I mean, if the educational framework were different and the values were different, it's really interesting empirical question to say who would feel most effective. And part of it is, what are we expecting the outcomes to be for the students, right? Are those different? Are some education systems more process oriented in terms of trying to get students to focus on the process versus focusing on the product? And the other thing too is that I think that sort of fits with Jackie's question about secondary is we see a very clear transition from elementary of focusing on process and getting students, support and foundational skills. And then when we transition to secondary, they're preparing them for university. And in university, we're awful about only focusing on product.
Yeah.
Right, so it's that orientation can be sort of followed from K to secondary, and the cultural context has another interesting layer.
It's whole package, including needs analysis, and teachers feeling obliged to prepare their students for those high stakes exams and what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's that's why I was pretty careful about saying these are elementary teachers in this
Yeah,
space
sure.
in Ontario, because I agree. I think the findings could be very different, looking at different populations of teachers. Absolutely. Thanks for that. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, feel free to shoot me an email or come visit me in my office. I'm often there. And otherwise, thanks so much for coming, everybody.
Thanks,
Terrific.
Deanna.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.